The Native Americans described the seventh generation principle. 7 generations previous actually impact the present moment. If we had 7 generations that were living in extreme bouts of stress, it impacts us.
Poor quality food, pollutants in our environment, they'll ultimately converge on the mitochondria and have an impact on its ability to produce energy.
If there is a baby that's being created in utero in the mother, and she herself is dealing with extremely high levels of stress, the child could actually be wired at birth for hypervigilance.
When we have this accumulation of debris in our cells, they don't work as well. They start releasing toxins that impact cells around them.
Napoleon Hill said that when we keep the sewer systems dirty, and when the sewer systems aren't able to purify, it can actually start to compound in the mind. And the mind can become very weak. It essentially atrophies the decision-making faculty in the mind.
Nature, that's the starting point. We didn't have any control over the hand we were dealt, but we can do a tremendous amount within our lives to build off that starting point.
When it comes to mitochondria, my, yours, and everybody's is inherited only from our biological mother. I find that fascinating. Can you explain that on a scientific level, but also on a personal level, that we only inherit our mitochondria from our biological mother?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So our mitochondria are derived from our maternal parent. And what's really neat about mitochondria is that for almost everything in our body, the DNA that makes the proteins that actually do the activities in our cell is stored in the nucleus. So maybe that's a term people have remembered, but the nucleus is really this center housing in our cells that has that, manuscript of life. It tells us how to make everything in our body. Mitochondria are unique in that there's mitochondrial DNA, and actually most of it that's outside of the nucleus, within the mitochondria. And that really just comes about from our development when, man and woman mate, and there is conception, that the energy producing components that lead to the mitochondria are exclusively within a woman's egg. So our mitochondria are maternally derived, and for better or for worse, we can thank our mothers for a lot of the mitochondria that we have in our body.
And for people that don't even know what mitochondria are, and I know we've heard about this for quite some time in science and even personal development, can you give a super high level, basic, kind of 10-year-old understanding of what mitochondria actually are?
Yeah, and perhaps some people have heard mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. Talk to a high school science student, biology, that probably be what comes right out of their mouth. And that is true. Mitochondria produce the vast majority of energy we need for every single cell in our body to function. So they are this energy factory that takes the food we eat and transforms it into energy that all of the different tissues in our body can use. So whether that's a heart to pump blood, our immune system to fight infection, that cellular energy is predominantly powered by the mitochondria. There are many other functions that the mitochondria have. They're not just this battery within our cells, and I'm sure we'll get into that throughout the conversation, but the mitochondria really do play a central role in our cellular energetics. And as that plays out over all our cells, how well our tissues function and overall how well we as a human function.
I remember that from high school. I'm dating myself. I graduated high school in 1998, Brad. But for the powerhouse aspect, I love this. I think about a power plant, it generates energy, but it has to have a fuel substrate in order to do so. So if the mitochondria is inherently this powerhouse of the human body, both on a metaphysical level and also a biological level, then what do you think is silently destroying our power through the mitochondria?
You're absolutely right. There's a substrate, and the key thing there is that our mitochondria has taken things from its environment to produce energy. And our environment is not always friendly to our mitochondria. So the mitochondria is this focal point where the food we eat, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, are transformed into this energy-yielding substrate, which we call adenosine triphosphate, but not to get too technical, ATP, the energy in our cells. However, there are a lot of things in our environment that aren't friendly to mitochondria. So things like poor quality food, pollutants in our environment, several other toxins, they'll ultimately converge on the mitochondria and have an impact on its ability to produce energy. So that mitochondria is really where we're taking the environmental inputs to produce energy But if our environment has some negative things in it, it's going to impact the health of the mitochondria and the energy we're able to produce.
What does that look like if you were just describing it from a high level, or also looking at it in a petri dish or in the human body? The siege on the mitochondria itself. Can we talk about just environmental first? We'll get into food. We'll even get into emotions as well and stress load. But from an environmental perspective, what should we be paying attention to in our environment when it comes to protecting the efficacy of the mitochondria?
Yeah, that's a great question, and can give a couple examples. And maybe one that we'll start with is UV radiation from the sun. So UV radiation from the sun, people have probably heard that, okay, if you are out in the sun, you increase your risk of certain skin cancers. And that is because of damage that the UV radiation has to proteins in our cells. So proteins are the things that actually do function. They do jobs in our cells. And it can be damaged by these UV radiation. Now, the mitochondria is made of proteins. And when those proteins get damaged, if there's an accumulation of enough of them, the actual mitochondria will be compromised. So I think that's one example of how the environment, and if we're not mindful of how we're interacting with the environment, that it can have a negative impact on our mitochondria.
What are some other ways besides sun? Sun is an interesting one. There's science on both sides when it comes to sun exposure for vitamin D, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm curious, is there anything else we should be looking for? I just had a gentleman on the podcast, and we talked about how the quality of our food, the quality of our water, and the quality of the air we breathe has a direct impact on our mental health, even some research pointing towards Alzheimer's and dementia. What's another big domino when it comes to mitochondrial health stacked against the environment?
Yeah, I'm glad we're staying on this because let the record show, sun is great. Do not avoid the sun in efforts to preserve your mitochondria.
Sun, y'all.
Just absolutely. And quite frankly, if we just tell people to spend more time outdoors, I think it'll be a lot of benefit. But definitely, it's just one of those things. There's the good and the bad with everything. We need to be mindful, but we certainly should not avoid sunlight. Another example would be some pollutants in our environment. So if we live in a very urban area where there's a lot of toxins from fumes that are emitted, that's one where we can have these actual chemicals that will interfere with how the proteins in our mitochondria function. And you'll see this in some parts of the world where people are maybe living a very sedentary life in a very urban populated area. They'll actually have more mitochondrial dysfunction than people living in areas without those negative toxins. So I think a domino that to be mindful of is just our environment. Now, we're talking about sun, we're talking about pollution, that maybe if we live or work in an area where those are high, you can't avoid these things at all costs, and you shouldn't, because a lot of people are going to be dependent on living or working in a certain area for various reasons. I think the key is just to be mindful of it, and that if we can have the understanding that there's a potential for these things to negatively impact our mitochondria and our well-being, that we can take appropriate countermeasures to operate most effectively and optimally in our environment.
I want to go back to the mother. It was so fascinating in my research and our previous conversation before we hopped on the pod. The inheritance from our biological mother is so profound. I think about Mark Wolyn's work, and It Didn't Start With You, and healing generational trauma, and even the science of epigenetics that actually plays the piano keys on top of the DNA. And I wonder if there's a baby that's being created in utero in the mother, and she herself is dealing with extremely high levels of stress. I've seen some of the research come out that on an emotional level, the child can actually be wired at birth for hypervigilance. I wonder how that would impact their mitochondria. And for people that are suffering with, let's say, inherited trauma or hypervigilance or just emotional loads in general, would they have to pay special attention to their mitochondria? And if so, how?
The intergenerational mitochondrial health is such a fascinating area, and one that it really is only starting to be explored more and more over the last few decades. And you're absolutely right that there can be an impact. Now, I'm not going to claim to be a world-leading expert in this area, but we can talk about some of the research and whether it's seen, like you're saying, some mitochondrial diseases or characteristic traits induced while even the mother is carrying a child, or even actually before. There's some fascinating work about how the second and third generations before a child is born can actually have these impacts on things like, say, alcoholism or other mental health states. Now, these are studies that are entirely preclinical, meaning they haven't translated this to humans yet, but there's some fascinating work that's being done by a few key people around the world. I'd be happy to share their information afterwards if you want to look into that. But it is an area where there's certainly an impact to be mindful of, not just for us, but for those who are going to come after us and caring for our mitochondria.
It makes sense to me on just an anecdotal level. I am not an epigenetic scientist. However, I'm fascinated by the research. It's in our life method program. It's in our teaching modules. And I look at the way that the Native Americans describe the seventh generation principle, where 7 generations previous and 7 generations in the future actually impact the present moment. So, for example, if we had 7 generations that were living in extreme bouts of stress, which is essentially most of our genealogy, right? My mostly Sicilian blood came over to Ellis Island, and as you know, Sicily was a conquered island, so they dealt with a lot of stress. Same thing with my English side. And I'm sure you've explored in this process not only your mitochondrial health, but also your epigenetics and the way that trauma is passed down to you. Do you find it fascinating that so much of our mitochondrial set point is actually predetermined before birth?
I do find it fascinating, absolutely. And I think that it's something that we are only going to understand more and more. It's certainly a factor, almost the nature, nurture. How much are these each playing into? We're talking about mitochondrial health, but so much in every facet of our life. And for, the view I've always had on it is that nature, that's the starting point. There's, as an individual sitting here, you yourself, me, myself, we didn't have any control over the hand we were dealt, so to speak. But the nurture component, I do think we should recognize as being just as, if not more impactful. While we start from a certain place, we can do a tremendous amount within our lives to build off that starting point. And the nature component is fascinating, and why we were kind of starting our life the way we did, but it's one half of the equation. And I think we do need to consider both that nature and nurture component when looking at not just the mitochondria, but our overall health and well-being.
Yeah, because there's this concept of longevity and then health span.
Yeah.
And I think about my desire for life. I was interviewing a guy named Dr. Pedram Shojai, theurbanmonk.com. And I said, do you want to live past 100? He said, well, if I can make it to 80, I'll probably live to 150. And I think what he meant by that was, in the next 20, 30, 40 years, we're going to see so much acceleration in science, specifically the science of epigenetics and aging and longevity. I mean, this is what timeline is at the nexus of. In my opinion, and why I'm so excited about this conversation is, can we not just live into our old age? Can we thrive? That's the big one for me as a parent of 2 children. So, Brad, what actually causes our cells to age before we feel, quote, old?
We have over 30 trillion cells in our body, right? So
30 trillion.
Think about that. We have over 30 trillion cells in our bodies. And if 1 or 2 of them isn't in the best shape, we're not going to maybe feel that difference. But over time, if there's an accumulation of these unhealthy cells, we will start to feel it, and it will present itself more and more. So really, I think why our cells age before we feel age is because it takes that accumulation, and not just 1 or 2 bad cells. It takes that 30 trillion moving more and more towards having a higher proportion of unhealthy cells before we actually present ourselves. A turnover is something I think a lot about. Our cells are constantly turning over, meaning we're making new cells and we're breaking down old cells or proteins within these cells. And that's always happening. If we nick our finger while we're cutting our fingernails, that's a damaged cell. But a couple weeks later, or even a couple days, that's repaired. We have that turnover. But when we get older, that turnover slows down and that damage accumulates. And then we start to feel it and see it more.
It's kind of like right now I'm dealing with a knee issue and I'm researching, should I do stem cells? Should I do PRP? Should I do myofascial release? And the answer is all of them. But I think about cellular cleanup and, the autophagy aspect and also correct me if I'm wrong, the mitophagy as well. This is really crucial, not just for our energy, but for the cleanup of the waste cells or the senescence in our body. Can you unpack that? It's a pretty large topic. If you've ever blown up your life for no logical reason, congratulations. Your biology works. You're not broken. You're just running an old pattern. After 10 years of podcasting and interviewing 800 plus of the sharpest minds and deepest hearts on planet Earth, I built something simple to help you interrupt these patterns fast. I kept running personally into the same stuff, and audience members would write to me and say, Josh, I'm dealing with the same core 3 things, which are expressed through emotional epigenetics that are our emotional patterns, our unconscious beliefs, and our environment. This self-liberation blueprint is a free training where you get clear on how these 3 areas are blocking your life, and in 10 days, you can move from being stuck and distorted on the inside to clear and on purpose on the outside. The self-liberation blueprint is a 10-day jumpstart that's perfect for the human being that feels stuck, but they just can't figure out why. Now, I built this with no smoke and mirrors. I know in our world, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors when it comes to personal growth and spiritual development. I built this with 24 years of my own health, wellness, and personal development life experience. So I can save you money and save you time and start getting your results as quickly as possible. On your first day, you're gonna go right into a self-assessment where we know exactly where you are and exactly where you get to be. We're gonna take you through a dream vision process and specific breath work to create your life vision that you desire in the future as if it's here right now. All of this is free because I'm here to give it to you as a mentor in the same way that my mentors gave it to me. It is purely just my gift to you. You also get free access to the Liberated Life Tribe, a community of people like you and I that are actually doing the inner work instead of just pretending that they're fine. By the time you're done, you're gonna know exactly where you are in your wellness pentagon, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and financially, and you're gonna have a map, a mindful action plan to move from clarity instead of distortion. This is not therapy for people that are broken. You're not broken. You're just bioenergetically burdened. And I'm here to tell you that removing these burdens is possible. And I believe you can do it. You don't need fixing. You just get to have a clear starting point and a plan that actually works with your biology. If you're ready to move forward with your life without forcing it, join me inside the Self-Liberation Blueprint by heading over to liberatedlife.com. Come join us.
So autophagy, or it directly translates to from Latin, is self-eating. But autophagy is just the breakdown of structures within our cells, the key process within our cells. And mitophagy is a specific form of autophagy that's specific to the mitochondria. So you can think of autophagy as this big umbrella, and mitophagy really is a key pillar, a key component of autophagy as a whole. So why that might impact our energy is that we talk about the removal of garbage, whether it's in the turnover or the cellular debris. I like to think about, why do we keep our house clean? If we have a dirty house, we're going to have smells, odor, there'll be less room to function. You'll probably have some upset family members or friends, or maybe you yourself will be upset with the dirty house. But it makes it tougher to function when we have this accumulation of debris. And that's the same in our cells. When we have this accumulation of debris in our cells, they don't work as well. They start releasing toxins that impact cells around them. So having this process of autophagy or mitophagy, in the case of mitochondria, is really key to removing that cellular garbage so that we can keep the healthiest possible cell.
What you're saying is scientific, but it's also a big advantage in personal development. I remember I was reading a book from Napoleon Hill called Outwitting the Devil. And he talked about, Hill was switched on to, I believe, now your and Timeline's understanding of autophagy and mitophagy. He said that when we keep the sewer systems dirty and when the sewer systems aren't able to purify and to cleanse the body, it can actually start to compound in the mind. And the mind can become very weak in the way that it makes decisions. It essentially atrophies the decision-making faculty in the mind. This is where the conversation really is powerful. And this is what I've been really waiting to talk to you about. The breakthrough with Urolithin A and the way that, let's be honest, a lot of people think they can get it just from eating pomegranates or just from eating certain foods. But the reality is that 80% of Americans do not have the gut microbiome to transform the pomegranates or the certain types of foods into this urolithin A. Can you start with what is urolithin A? How was it found? Why is it so important for us? Because it's a real game changer for our health and longevity.
So urolithin A is a natural molecule, and it's what we call a postbiotic. So to start there with, what is this? It's a postbiotic, meaning it's not a prebiotic, it's not a probiotic, it's a postbiotic. And what postbiotics are is when we eat our food, our gut microbiome will transform the components of that food into other molecules that can be released into the body to have any effect. So you're absolutely right when you mention pomegranates. The precursor to urolithin A is very high in pomegranates, other nuts, berries, and this is a type of polyphenol called alligitanin. So alligitannins, when we eat them, if we have the right gut microbiome, it'll transform that into urolithin A, and urolithin A will then be released into our body to have its effects, which we'll get into. But you're right, where over 80% of Americans can't actually make that conversion. So you can eat as many pomegranates as you want, and this is something that the Timeline team has studied, actually comparing how much urolithin A is produced in various populations when they consume pomegranate juice, which is a concentrated form of those alligitannins, versus urolithin A consumed with direct supplementation. And yeah, over 80% of people can't make a meaningful amount of urolithin A just by consuming pomegranate juice. So we can get into some of that, but why maybe we should think about, why does this even matter? What is urolithin A doing? And how it was found was by the Timeline team. Originally when they were founded, Timeline was based out of the Swiss Institute of Technology, which is Switzerland's MIT. So there's so many brilliant scientists, physicians here, and they were looking to understand what natural foods that were having seemingly beneficial health effects, why they were so good. And so it was while studying the pomegranates that urolithin A was discovered. And originally they thought it was a waste product because we would metabolize it and it would be there. It's probably just a waste product of metabolism. But as the team started looking more and more at it, they were seeing incredible results in these preclinical studies. So things like improving lifespan in these preclinical models, up to 48%, which is right on par with the gold standard caloric restriction. It was increasing strength and endurance, 13, 20% in these animals. And that was really promising and quite unheard of data. So that's what the team at Timeline has been doing over the last 15 years, is leading the actual clinical development of urolithin A, or Mitopure as it's sold as, to see, does it have a clinical effect? And if so, what is that? Where can it be best used? And that's something that the team has been going after, and it is quite promising, but I know we'll get into that. It's one of many things we can do for the mitochondrial health.
We get to go deep into that because the majority of people in my audience, and really, let's be honest, on YouTube and on the web sphere itself, we're all trying to answer one deep question for ourselves, and that is, how do we live life well? How do we thrive? And I believe it's this amalgamation of the lens that's on the screen right now, the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and financial nourishment of self. But the challenge is that we don't live in our ancestors' world anymore. It'd be very easy for us to, with a perfectly healthy gut microbiome, to be able to consume the pomegranates or even some of the other foods that I'd love to learn about that could actually transfer into urolithin A. In other words, we don't live in that time, we live now. And so I really had to go against the grain when I first started 10 plus years ago podcasting, to sound the alarm and say, guys, we have to supplement. It's not even a question anymore. If we want to have a healthy life and a health span, regardless of what happens with, medical ascension and AI tools and health technologies, and all these things are great. But at the end of the day, we don't have the microbiome our ancestors had. And I think that's a key point that I'd love to go a little bit more into so that people can really grok this. What is it about our microbiome that's off in the first place that would make us block the transfer of urolithin A?
I think there's two key things to look at. Why do we not produce urolithin A? One is the actual food we eat, right? You're right on the money when you say we don't eat as well as our ancestors did. So to produce a postbiotic like urolithin A, you first need to eat the right foods that have the precursors to these postbiotics. Not as many people are eating fruits, vegetables, nuts, or foods that would have these precursors in them. So that's the first thing. We're not eating the right foods. And second, yeah, our microbiome is in much worse shape than it probably was for our ancestors, hundreds, thousands of years ago. And why is that? Why is the microbiome damaged? Well, a lot of that we can find parallels from the toxins and environmental pollutants that we talked about with what impacts mitochondria. And you can think about the microbiome really as a living ecosystem within our body. It is filled with millions of beneficial bacteria that can help us actually make these conversions. And what we see in people who can't produce urolithin A or who have other gut microbiome derived shortcomings is they lose a richness and a diversity of this microbiome environment. So there's less variety in the microbes that are in our microbiome, as well as less of them. So that richness and diversity really are two big areas that our microbiome health has suffered. And subsequently, you combine that with not eating the right foods and having a worse conversion system. Not many people can make urolithin A.
Yeah, it's profound. It's on the screen right now, joshtrent.com/timeline nutrition for y'all to click and go over and check it out while you're watching. The part for me that's most fascinating here is the gut-brain axis and how our brain is so profoundly altered by the health of our gut. The axis I'd love to talk about because people might think of an axis like a globe spinning on a stand, but the axis is so complex in the way that our enteric nervous system innervates into our CNS and ANS and how we can actually have a strong mind through having microbiome health, but also urolithin A. Can you talk about the nexus of these three things? Urolithin A, mental health, and gut health.
Again, like so many things, your audience is lucky because you're on the forefront of really the cutting edge of where this science is going.
We just want the truth, Brad.
Yeah. Hey, we
just want the truth.
I'm with you. Well, we're in it to try to figure it out. We want to figure out how we can best thrive in our lives. So the intersection of those things, I guess one, we'll talk about urolithin A maybe just after this, because the gut-brain axis itself is really one of several axes that I think are only starting to at least even have some acknowledgement of being worth exploration. So there are some links, between the various diseases you mentioned that perhaps there's some kind of connection. And it's the same for the oral microbiome, our oral health having an impact on our cognitive health. And if we look at, what's common in all these, how are they connected? I think the mitochondria one is a key one, because in all of these tissues, all of these cells, it's playing a key role in providing the energy that they need to function optimally. And so while we might look, our gut microbiome health isn't as good, our oral health isn't as good, our cognitive health isn't as good, certainly there could be cases where these are different things causing this, but we could also take a bigger picture view and say, all right, well, what's common? And if there's a common denominator between these and it's impacted, like the mitochondria, that could be impacting all these systems and their interaction, because the body isn't just a gut that's beside a brain. They're connected. The mind is communicating with the gut and vice versa. Our sensations of hunger can be looked at that. What's going on in the gut will tell our brain to release certain hunger or satiety, or saying we're full, hormones and things like that. And that maybe that's a kind of a simple example, but just one of how in our normal life these systems are interacting. And you can imagine that when you get into a pathological or disease clinical realm, that certainly if one is not in the best health, it will have an impact on the other. So these systems are so intricately connected, and that's only becoming better understood. When it comes to something like urolithin A, that is one where, it's potentially targeting, or it is targeting the mitochondria, which is common throughout them all. So there's something there. But with urolithin A, I think it's one of those rare exceptions, and how you're saying, there are things we need to supplement with. I'm all food first, but there are certain powers of our food that we cannot unlock. And supplementation is the key to that. Urolithin A is certainly one of those where via direct supplementation, we can unlock the power of something that we should get from our food, but we can't.
I love that you said there are certain ways that we cannot unlock the power of our food. What do you mean by that?
Well, this postbiotic is one example where if we can eat all the right ingredients, we still won't be able to produce the beneficial postbiotic that is urolithin A. Maybe another example that we can talk about in nutrition would be anabolic resistance and protein as we get older. So this is, away from the mitochondria specifically, but protein's essential in our diet. It is the building blocks. It's providing the building blocks for all the structures that we need in our cells. As we get older, our bodies respond less and less well to protein in the sense that we need more protein to do the same amount in our cells. We're less sensitive to the synthesis of new proteins that happens just by eating dietary protein. That's called anabolic resistance. So the protein recommendations are pretty standard across the lifespan, but there's more and more evidence showing that as we age, particularly in the 7th, 8th, 9th decade of life, if we're going to have a youthful response to things like dietary protein, it requires a higher dose. Now, lifestyle things can modify this. If we exercise, we can make our muscles and other really protein-heavy tissues respond like a young person. But if we're a sedentary, older individual, we aren't able to unlock the power of protein fully like we would if we were younger. And so I guess that would be an example of how can we not unlock all the power in our food?
It's great because I hate to even say the phrase alternative health because I feel like alternative health is actually becoming more mainstream. But I think about the just incredible abundance of supplementation out there. I mean, it's not regulated by the FDA. That you can go on Amazon and it's kind of like rolling the dice in Vegas. When I think about how many millions of dollars that Timeline has invested into Mitopure and to Urolithin A, can you give people an understanding of how Mitopure is just inherently different than NAD or CoQ10? There's a real specific way that Mitopure hits mitophagy that really these other supplements can't do.
You just said the key point. Mitopure is the only clinically proven activator of mitophagy. It's the only clinically proven natural molecule that will activate mitophagy. So maybe to take that in two parts. One, how does Mitopure Urolithin A compare to these other mitochondrial related supplements like NAD? And then get into the research that actually goes behind it. You can think about mitochondria in three different phases. So there's mitochondrial biogenesis, which is a creation of new mitochondria. There's the mitochondrial efficiency, where our mitochondria will actually fuse and separate to make a more efficient energy system. And then there's mitophagy, the removal of dysfunctional mitochondria. So there are these three phases of a mitochondrial life cycle. Things like CoQ10 will try to make a mitochondria more efficient. NAD will try to provide the precursors so that we can make more mitochondria and make more energy. But what's unique about Mitopure is that it is the only molecule that targets that mitophagy component. And actually in doing so, will feed forward into mitochondrial biogenesis. So what's really unique about Mitopure is that it just targets that mitophagy component, which, as we've talked about, removing that cellular debris is really what's important to staying youthful and thriving as we progress through life. So Mitopure is unique in that sense compared to all the other mitochondrial supplements. And that is something that doesn't come in a short amount of time. You don't realize that or be able to say that just overnight. And it's really what separates Timeline apart from other supplements, as well as, the other kind of knockoff Urolithin A supplements you'll see, where there's decades of the high-class clinical research showing that Mitopure is safe, it's effective, and now expanding the benefits that it has for individuals. And that's really uncommon. Most supplements companies, when you say it's like rolling a dice in Vegas, that's probably a bit generous. It's the wild, wild west. It's not regulated. You can put anything out there, and it's more of if you start selling something, wait till someone has an issue with it, and then they'll come after you. you don't need to get approval to do a lot of the things that are available in our local stores or online. And Timeline's really taken the opposite approach. It says, okay, the burden of proof is on us to see if this is safe, effective, and we're going to hold ourselves to the highest standards. So all of the clinical studies are published in the top medical and scientific journals, and they're out there. It's taken time, over almost now 20 years of this research. It's two words, and search. You search, you find something, and then you do it again. And that's really what Timeline's committed to, is having the highest standards of quality and science, to know that if something works, we'll tell you, but also if it doesn't, we'll tell you.
I want to speak to the heart of the matter. There are so many decisions that we can make as human beings. And, the Dunbar effect, or the 150 decisions at a high tension rate per day that we can make. There's lots of scientific theories from a psychological lens about decision fatigue. For me, this is an easy decision because the benefits are so vast. And there's such a deep well of proof for the anecdotal and also for the scientific. But the challenge, and I wonder if you could speak to this, is that it's not like it's an energy drink. It's not like you're going to take it and all of a sudden feel this rush of energy. It's a long, kind of almost a gardener tending to the weeds in his or her garden effect. Yeah. Can you speak to that and the challenges that it's been for you in Timeline to be so excited about this research, so excited about the long-term impacts for mental health, gut health, just overall cellular signaling, yet people are trying to make financial decisions based on the energy that they get or based on the immediate result that they get from the supplements they buy. How have you overcome that?
Just being able to speak with great leaders like yourself, where there's an education component to it. And at the end of the day, we have the same mission, where we are all looking to figure out, how do we live the best quality life? And if we're talking about the mitochondria, let alone the recycling process of mitochondria, this isn't something that's on the forefront of our mind, but clearly is instrumental in living the best quality life. And so as the Timeline team has found, made these discoveries, that's something that it's on us to help educate people on, where is this useful? Why might it be beneficial? And really give people the tools to make the decisions for themselves on how they can pursue their ultimate thriving life. So where does that fall on in terms of the research? And I think we can maybe get into that, in that, it's not a magic pill. It's not something like caffeine where you'll feel a spike in energy immediately and then it'll be gone. When we are rewiring our cellular energy and improving ourselves for the long run, that doesn't happen overnight. That takes the consistent use. And that's what has been seen in the clinical studies, where certainly we see the improved mitochondrial and cellular energetics after a month of using Mitopure. But then it's not until 2 or 4 months where we see, the 10% improvements in strength, 9% improvements in our cardiorespiratory fitness and endurance. These things are happening after months of use, because it takes a while to rewire, our cellular health and the mitochondria that really underpin it.
It's so profound for the mind. I want to go back to this because mental health is such an important piece of my life. My mom was manic bipolar, still is. I think she struggled with a software issue. For me, it wasn't a hardware issue. It was what we talked about in the beginning of this conversation that is really life-altering, and that is, what is the ways that the Native American principle impacts the baby, the fetus in utero, and then when the child comes out, how they actually are preset or predetermined to have a certain way that they must feed their mitochondria and have this autophagy and mitophagy. Otherwise, they most likely will live less. They most likely will live a less quality of life and not live as long. How does mitochondrial health impact mood and mental health specifically? Can we go into that both on an anecdotal level from you personally, but also a scientific level? This is really, really big.
Certainly. Well, and I think the anecdotal level, we can all think about times where maybe we're feeling a little beat down, or we're lacking our energy, maybe our normal get up in our step. That diffuses into our entire life, and we are maybe less effective people, less loving, less hardworking, or just less focused. We lack that clarity. And that's something that can happen when we're struggling with our energy. And as we've talked about, mitochondria are certainly important for our energy. I will highlight that, of course, we're going to stay I'll be very clear with you and your audience with where I'm talking science or not, because we definitely want to talk about the personal experiences. And I will just flag that we are running, actually, we just kicked off our 25th clinical study, and it is looking at cognition and some components of how our actual brain will function with a Mitopure. So that's ongoing right now. And it's Mitopure specifically, don't have data to speak to that yet, but sharing anecdotal evidence, that's one of the biggest feedbacks we hear from people, is that clarity or the sleep quality that's so important for our mental health. The brain have the most mitochondria of any tissue in our body, right? It's a very energy demanding tissue. And if we can improve the mitochondrial health, we would think it could have some benefits on cognition. And that's something that we can hypothesize, but we need the data to say with any degree of certainty. And so we're running those studies now, and we'll be able to come back in a year or so and talk about what we're seeing.
What is the hypothesis that you're using the scientific Socratic method to learn about? I hesitate to say prove, because I know you're not trying to prove anything. You may have a hypothesis with a desire to prove that there's a corollary between urolithin A and cognition strength. But what is it that you're in the hypothesis for?
I think something to notice about science, it's a little technical, but in science, you assume there's no difference in anything, right? So you kind of, this is just null hypothesis testing, as we call it. You assume,
well, if you're a conscious scientist, then yes, there are many science programs that are set out to find and cherry pick the data. But yes. I know you're not like that, right? You're coming with a clean slate, and you're neither attached to the outcome nor in disalignment with the outcome.
Yeah, and doing the highest quality work, it's going to lead you in a good direction one way or other, whether it's telling you something is helpful or whether it's telling you that something should be avoided or it's not worth it. So just being honest with the data, that's a non-starter. Highest quality data, and interpret it as unbiasedly as possible. That's the objective. So in science, you're assuming there's no difference, and you're not proving something. You're just making yourself more and more confident that maybe it is. The burden of proof to see things, to definitively say something's doing something, is incredibly high. Scientific space. And so that's something, yes, in these studies could show one thing. It could be kind of a mixed bag of results. And by really putting in those hard miles, which so few people do in this space, of repeating studies and showing things again and again, that increases the confidence of the impact and intervention, whether it be, a nutritional supplement or an exercise program. The more we study it, the more confident we are if something's good for us and what benefit it's going to have.
So then what is the hypothesis? I'm going to dig in a little more.
Yeah.
What is the hypothesis that you're not attached to, but that you're hoping will come true?
Yeah. So the hypothesis in this study that we're looking at cognition, it is looking at in individuals who have self-reported fatigue or low energy. There's a cognitive scale that we can use called a PROMIS questionnaire, and it's actually used by the NIH and FDA for looking at our ability to process information, how we're feeling in our day-to-day lives. And so this is a validated questionnaire that is used to survey thousands of people. And that's what we're doing in this study. It's the largest nutrition study on brain health that's been done. So what we have is just our hypothesis, or our null hypothesis in this case, is that there will be no difference between these treatments. Now, when we collect this data, how we would interpret it as a scientist is say, okay, if there is enough of a change, we would say, we think that there might be a benefit here. And as we repeat this study more and more, we'll be able to develop, if there's an effect, we'll kind of round out our conclusion to say, okay, it seems like this product is beneficial for cognition and our mental clarity. So our hypothesis in this is, of course, that by improving the mitochondrial health of our cells with Mitopure, that will have cognitive benefit. But we go into it saying, we're assuming there's no benefit. We're going to study and try to prove that wrong. And the outcome will be in the data. We'll see how it plays out from not just our interpretation. The reason we do these studies to the highest standard is that websites to remove bias. So pre-registration, you can go read about this study's protocol online. You put it up on a public forum that's run by government agencies around the world and say, here's what we're going to do. We haven't started yet. You go do it, and then you come back and say, okay, here's what we found. So you can go and look before a study even starts, if it's done well, that, okay, did they actually measure what they say they were going to measure before they ran this study? You run it, and then as you go through, I know we talked a little bit about the peer review process and the pros and cons of it, but the idea that you're exposing yourself then to even more criticism of people who are some of the recognized leaders in this field. So it's not just the one scientist's opinion of here's what the data says. If it's really done to the highest level, it's fully transparent, and you can see for yourself, what did they say they were going to do? How did they do it? What did they ultimately find? And what are the strongest critiques of it? And that's really where the burden of proof takes a long time to accomplish.
This is why clinical trials and what you're talking about, the largest nutritional study ever done, which is fascinating. There's so much money that goes into these. It begs the question, if a company like Timeline is going to have so much investment and so much momentum with the hope that there's the desired outcome, which is a corollary between Urolithin A and cognition, to me, non-medically, it's a no-brainer since we're talking about mental health. The brain is the hungriest organ. And then you stack it with digestion and thermogenesis or thermogenesis, like these are very hungry systems. And if the powerhouse of the cell is the mitochondria that feeds the hungriest systems, why wouldn't it have an impact?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And that's why theories are great. It's the phrase, it's great in theory. It is. It makes good sense. We can have a logical argument of why Mitopure could have a benefit on these systems, but you have to generate the data to find out. There's a lot of things that can come as a surprise. And we see this all throughout science. Why is there a slightly higher rate of cardiovascular disease or heart attacks in highly trained athletes? I thought exercise was good for us. That was a thought, with some data for a 10-year stretch. That makes no sense. And really only by studying it can you actually tease apart the details and understand, okay, here's what's going on in these cases. It takes a long time to do the studies. At the end of the day, we're just trying to find the truth. And that's what's going to happen with decades and decades of research.
So how do we stack the Mitopure and the Urolithin A with exercise? In other words, what happens when you stack Mitopure and proper exercise?
Yeah, so that is a great thing. And I would be the first to tell you that in terms of lifestyle interventions, exercise is the best thing we can do for our long being. In my opinion, for our health span, exercise, it's one of the biggest pieces that's missing. Less than 25% of people are doing at least any resistance training, weightlifting, and not many more are doing any form of cardiovascular exercise. And if exercise came in a pill, it would be the most widely prescribed drug or supplement in the world. I could go on for hours about the benefits of exercise. So exercise is, that is one of the biggest levers we can pull for our well-being. So it would make sense if we take something like Mitopure, where there's an obvious benefit of direct supplementation. How would that combine? And so we've started studying this more in recent years, not just at Timeline, but more so with independent investigators around the world who are doing these studies and experts in the area. And the long and short is it does seem to have benefits, and the actual mechanisms behind that, beyond just mitochondrial function, are really what we're starting to look at now. So to give you an overview of what's happened, there was an independent investigator out of China, one of the top sports institutes there, who looked at really well-trained weightlifters. After 8 weeks of taking Mitopure versus a placebo, they were increasing their muscle strength and muscle endurance performance. So this is really well-trained weightlifters. I actually just published a study led by Professor Louise Burke, who's one of the top sports scientists in the world. She's based down in Australia, looking at Mitopure in elite runners going into the last Olympic cycle. This was at an altitude training camp, taking Mitopure or a placebo. And there were some markers of muscle damage were reduced in these individuals. So there seems to be an impact on not just performance, which we had already seen in the studies on, say, older and middle-aged adults where they were improving strength, but that was translating to these weightlifters, and now seeing some indication that it might be through the recovery process, that renewal of cells, where Mitopure can have some benefit in really well-trained athletes. So the studies on sports are increasing, and I can tell you there will be a few that I've caught wind of coming down the pipeline in the coming months. But certainly stacking Mitopure and exercise is a great combination to benefit not just our mitochondrial and physical health, but those are our two main pillars in our well-being. So I think it makes a lot of sense to combine those two.
Does exercise, specifically strength training, resistance training, literally grow new mitochondria in the body?
Exercise as a whole does. So mitochondrial biogenesis, or that creation of new mitochondria, would more traditionally be associated with cardiovascular exercise. So things like running or cycling. And it was kind of thought, weightlifting makes your muscles big. Cardio helps your heart, helps your mitochondria. And what's become clear more over the last, really I'd say 5, 6, 7 years is how actually there's a lot of overlap between these, where there are tremendous mitochondrial benefits from lifting weights. So you can see this both over studies where they look at a weightlifting program and the function of these mitochondria. So how much energy they can produce increases with weightlifting. Or you'll see the physical structure when we take microscope images of the mitochondria. The area where we produce energy in our mitochondria gets bigger and healthier with weightlifting. So there are these studies now that coming out showing that weightlifting is very beneficial for the mitochondria. And really what it's doing is, I guess I should say, why would we grow mitochondria? The key is disturbing homeostasis. So if we want to cause a change, we need to disrupt our body's norm. And that's exactly what exercise does. If we go do a hard training session, or even a little training session that's more than what we're used to, like walking up a flight of stairs, if that's tough for us, our body's going to say, hey, I need more energy, or I need stronger muscles. And it's going to start to adapt. And when we do that regularly, over time, we'll have those benefits of stronger muscles, healthier mitochondria, better endurance.
This is great. I look at the concept of hormesis that we've described on the show with other leaders, and whether it's a 40-pound weight vest fasted like I do in the morning, I'll take a microdose of mushrooms, a very small amount. I'll go out, I'll take my supplements, I'll go out on a walk, and I have some of the clearest thoughts that I ever have in my life. And it's not just the psilocybin. It's because I'm moving my body. I'm increasing respiration. I'm increasing perspiration. I'm detoxing. I'm getting sunlight. In other words, I'm stacking, Brad. I'm stacking these different health components together. Yeah. And then I look at, coming back to, I'm fortunate enough to have built my life to have a cold plunge and a sauna and a strength training room. But I've designed my life in that way because I care about myself. I've learned, and I'm still learning, how to love myself and care for myself, like I know you and we all are, right? That's why we're here. We're learning how to nourish ourselves on this podcast. Do you have a Goldilocks zone for yourself? And how do you run your life from a health perspective? If you could just give us a 30,000-foot view of how you personally, as a scientist, as a PhD, understands the power of movement, perspiration, respiration, strength training. Give us the high level on how you run your life for health in a day.
Yeah, in a day, I'd say there's a few key components, and I'm first totally with you. It's a journey. We're all getting better with it. I'm right there on that journey with you. There are always things we are learning how to do better. So what are the keys for me in my health? There's really a few key areas, and it actually just aligns with what I would say are my 5 key pillars of health span, which is that if we eat well, exercise, spend time with our friends and family, sleep well, and use targeted supplementation. So if I just kind of go through the main 4, we've talked a lot about the supplementation, which is really just getting the next level of our food, unlocking power of our food. But the other key 4, so for me, exercise is the number one thing. talk about the clarity that you have from it. As we accumulate more evidence on exercise, what's seen is not just the strength benefits. It's shown that, okay, exercise is having, in some case, a similar, if not even bigger effect than a lot of the antidepressive drugs that are prescribed now for mental health. That's something that as the evidence accumulates, we can say with more confidence. And, those are the publications starting to come out of, aside from strength or endurance, how beneficial is exercise? So you could go on and on about the benefits, but for me, a key is moving every day. I like to exercise in the morning. So for me, 3 days a week, that's a run, and a couple days a week, that's lifting. And then 1 day a week, at least for me, flexibility, like yoga, is something that's not just meditative and mindful, but having the flexibility for me is one that I notice a key difference, just my mental well-being. When I know I can move, I've got my range of motion. So for me, doing something physical every day, even if it's just 10 minutes of sprints, in the bike lane, as before anyone's up, go out at 5 o'clock in the morning and do some sprints. That is a non-negotiable for me in my life. The nutrition we've talked about, that is one that's a daily practice. We eat multiple times a day, most often, and really making the right decisions where we're eating the right number of calories for us. We're getting all our macronutrients, particularly enough protein, and the micronutrients, so vitamins, minerals, that are essential to a well-rounded diet. A good diet can look a lot of different ways and can be tailored to an individual's preferences. So for me, that's one where I just have the system, I stick with it. Sleep is admittedly the one for me that I am the first to compromise. That's the one that's the active, I need to be better with my sleep for me to improve my quality of life. I sleep very well, but if, say, work gets busy or I have a friend in town, I want to make sure I exercise. Duration is the one that I will compromise before any of the others. And so that's for me, the current focus on kind of my journey of well-being is getting to bed. For me, it's I've read my book and I'm in bed at an earlier hour, because that's one for me where I notice it'll be the spiral to things coming undone if I get off track.
That's a really great window, especially from a scientist. I look at why we do what we do in the world. Like, what drives me to do this podcast was the opposite of what I received from loving caregivers when I was younger. And so I don't blame anyone. I think to blame anyone, it actually takes the power away from us to change. So I love and honor my lineage and my parents that brought me here. Yet there was a vacuum that was created. And Aristotle, one of the best philosophers, said that nature hates a vacuum. And nature hates a vacuum because the vacuum has to be filled. It's like the sodium potassium pump in the body, right? It's like high-low pressure that we learned about in high school. There is always going to be a decision point when we take a supplement, when we choose to walk, when we choose to exercise, when we choose to have a vulnerable conversation with our wife or husband or boyfriend or girlfriend. There's these choice points, Brad. And this is something that science can't fully understand about the human condition yet. Science is beautiful. I think science and spirituality both deserve an equal seat at the table. I think they're equally powerful because it's a way for us to understand what it is to be a human. But, what I'm getting at here, the point I'm saying is when we ruminate, when we go back and forth of should we eat healthy foods, should we walk, even the question creates fatigue. Even the question creates atrophy and creates low energy. I think, and this is what I'd love to end our podcast on, this profound exclamation point. All change is counterintuitive when it's first taken upon. All change is counterintuitive. We don't feel like exercising, but we choose to do it because we love ourselves. We don't choose to invest in supplements, but we do it because we understand that science and our metaphysics know that they're good for us. How have you, as a scientist, personally, and also with people that you've talked to in your community, how do you walk people through that choice point of all change being counterintuitive at its starting place, but then the rewards become really an identity transformation of who the person actually is?
The best people in the world are comfortable being uncomfortable. And this was something I learned during my time as a competitive athlete. So I was a pretty high level golfer and played 4 years in the NCAA. And that was something that was told to me when I was 12 years old by a brilliant sports psychologist that I was lucky enough to work with. Dr. Paul Dooland is his name. But he said this: the best people in the world are comfortable being uncomfortable, meaning change is counterintuitive. It's not going to feel good. You're not going to like it. You may not want to do it. But if we believe that it is for a better purpose or a better outcome, we will do that. And when we make that tough, seemingly decision to do what we think is right, over time, we'll become more and more comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think that is something that I've always held as, as a really key thought in my mind. I think it leads into where you're going, which is, okay, what's that decision point on knowing something's worth it? Right? How do we know something is right? And a lot of times we won't know for sure. As a scientist, that's my training. I can talk about what might be the right interpretation of clinical data, or the effect or lack of effect of a supplement or exercise program, because those are areas I've studied for decade plus. But understanding what is right, what is best, and you mentioned Aristotle. I'll go to Aristotle's teacher, Plato. Big question: what is good? What truly is the nature of good? What does it mean? It's easy to say what's good. What is a good human? What is a good life? What is a good husband, father, mother, wife? These are things that science doesn't have a clear-cut answer. As I could say, hey, stats show this. It really gets at the heart of something we all deal with and interact with on a daily basis of what is good. And I think that's something that I appreciate you sharing your story, and me just as much. I'm trying to figure it out too and do the best I can. For me, a lot of it does come down to love, the family, with love of myself, my family, the family I want to build, friends, and the work and impact you can have on other people's lives. That love really for me is kind of a guiding light in what I consider good. But like everything, that just gets refined over time. And it's a very active journey that for me, as well as I'm sure almost everyone else is on, of how do we figure out what that ultimate good is, and use that as the decision framework or guiding principle as we go through life.
That's a great exclamation point. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and we covered so much ground. What do you feel like we missed when it comes to this understanding of mitochondria and urolithin A and cognition and overall cellular health? I mean, there's millions of hours we could spend, but what do you feel like we missed today?
Yeah, I think I appreciate you having me. I agree. It's been a great discussion. I appreciate the breadth that we can cover in this time, contrary to many other engagements that I'm lucky enough to do. So this has been a lot of fun, and definitely look forward to continuing the conversation. I think the one thing I would just maybe reiterate is that process that we're on. It's a reiterative process, that journey of living our best life, finding out how we can maximize our health span. That is ongoing. And as is the work around the mitochondria, how it impacts all these different tissues, not just the muscle or the brain, like we talked about, but the skin and the immune system. And those are areas that Timeline is actively doing a lot of work right now. And that's the same thing that's leading, in our case, our company, where we're going to only put out things that we've clinically studied, and that evidence is available for people to make these decisions. So I'll say there's been great growth, of course, but I would encourage people to stay tuned, whether it's at, our website, the offer we have for your listeners, but there's some really exciting stuff coming beyond just the muscle and the brain, because the mitochondria are pervasive through our body. So got a great skincare line you can see behind me that's come out, just started our 11th clinical trial on skin. And really, we're just trying to do the best as a biotech company in the nutrition, skincare, and health span space to help people live the best life they can.
Well, we can all spend money in so many different areas. Why would anyone choose to spend money on alcohol and fried foods and to impress people they don't like, for people that really don't care too much about them and going drinking on the weekends. Can we just take a deep breath and put our money where it actually matters? And that is our body. So thank you for being on the show. It's on the screen right now, y'all. joshtrent.com/timeline nutrition. The code is Josh and you get 30% off, which is very generous because these supplements are not inexpensive to create. There's millions and millions of dollars that have gone into the development of this. And so share this podcast with somebody who really has lethargy, somebody who's got brain fog, somebody who's, age 20 all the way up to age 100 plus. This is a fit for all of us because we all have mitophagy and autophagy, and we all deserve to have the best body possible. So until we see you again on another podcast, I am Josh Trent. This has been Brad Currier, PhD. And I want to remind you that peace is really the fuel substrate for all the conversations and all the things that matter. I'm wishing you love. I'm wishing you wellness. But most importantly, I'm wishing you peace and power, because you cannot have power unless it comes from peace. We'll talk with you soon.